Barack Obama's visit to Cuba last week, the first by a sitting U.S. president in almost 90 years, is the latest step in a gradual diplomatic thaw between the two countries. The visit, so rich in symbolic value, got a lot of play in the U.S. news media. But for many Cubans, the tone and the framing of that coverage exposed some cliches that said more about the American media's preconceptions about Cuba than it said about the story itself. Cuba's own state media coverage, and the state controls every major news outlet on that island, was suspicious both of the U.S. and of domestic voices calling for reform. So it, too, played to type. However, the normalization process is just that. It's a process. It will continue. And as it unfolds, media from both sides of the ideological divide have narratives in need of updating. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the blind spots and tunnel vision that come with reporting on and from Cuba.
It was the week that Cuba, the island isolated for so long, was pushed into the international spotlight. An historic visit from the U.S. President Barack Obama.
I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas.
After more than half a century of restricted access, the U.S. media arrived in hordes, ready to report on the latest chapter in the Cuban-U.S. détente. And as press conferences go, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Obama and Cuban President Raúl Castro agreeing to take questions from the U.S. media, broadcast live on TV.
Why do you have Cuban political prisoners? ¿Y por qué no los suelta?
Dame la lista ahora mismo de los presos políticos para soltarlos. Dime el nombre o los nombres. Y si hay esos presos políticos, antes de que llegue la noche, van a estar sueltos.
But in the age of the digital revolution, time waits for no man. Within minutes, lists of names appeared all over social media.
Lo esencial de ese momento fue
What's most important was the speed of responses, which nowadays is very different to when Raúl Castro was 20, or even 40 for that matter. Today, responses come quicker, but they aren't necessarily correct, because there were all sorts of numbers posted on social media.
En las redes han aparecido cualquier cifra.
How many political prisoners does the United States hold in Cuba, in the Guantanamo naval base turned prison? I think the latest figure is 91. So the United States holds more political prisoners in Cuba than the Cubans do, but I haven't seen that mentioned anywhere in the press coverage.
And it wasn't just political coverage. Sports fell into the same trap. When Obama and Castro took in a baseball game in Havana, ESPN, the US-based sports network, televised the game and threw in this tweet for good measure, making the point that there is poverty in the shadow of the stadium. And once again, it took Twitter to show the images ESPN could tweet out from places like New York, Atlanta, Detroit, but never does.
ESPN, as one of the major medias in the United States, was just promoting the anti-Cuban propaganda. It's not that they can't put it into context, but they won't. And if you put it in context, then the American media can see that, wait a minute, there's this huge embargo against Cuba that was established in the early 1960s and has caused so much damage.
You know, the embargo has also been used by the Cuban government as an excuse to crack down on bloggers and independent journalists, and has played well in the hands of the Cuban government in terms of restricting civil liberties and media freedoms.
Civil liberties, media freedoms, human rights, these have historically been the issues around which the US mainstream media have constructed their Cuba narrative. The Washington Post, which has been skeptical of Obama's diplomatic mission from the off, and the Miami Herald, much of whose readership is the anti-Castro Cuban-American exile community. Both papers ran multiple op-eds in the run-up to the visit, accusing the president of conceding too much too soon. We asked the papers to respond to criticism that coverage on Cuba's political system was disproportionate. The response from Fred Hyatt, editorial page editor at The Post. I don't believe there's such a thing as devoting too much attention to the issues of freedom and human rights.
Any media that contributes to the image of polarization that is shown from in other countries about Cuba is a media that is coming with some preconceived idea, and it's not going to help the people. Also, any media that tries to show Cuba like a country with black or white, like a country with only extremes, is a media that is not helping to find solutions.
For a North American in general and a journalist in particular, it is quite complicated to understand Cuban reality because they're very different countries. For a Cuban journalist, the story is about lifting the embargo. For a North American journalist, the angle is human rights. These are two very different perspectives. In Cuba, we have a saying that says it all. The bartender thinks in a way, and a drunk person thinks in another.
The Castros and Cuba's aversion to the so-called free press goes way back to 1954 in Guatemala, when a CIA-funded coup deposed the democratically elected president of that country. Che Guevara was there. He saw how central a CIA-funded clandestine radio station, La Voz de la Liberación, or Voice of Liberation, was to that outcome. In 1959, Guevara told a Colombian journalist, "Newspapers are the instruments of the oligarchy. We have to get rid of all newspapers because you can't have a revolution with press freedom." Cuban media has borne the brunt of that. The state controls all mainstream news outlets and is accused of paranoia. But there are reasons to back that up. In addition to CIA plots to assassinate Fidel Castro, there's been an information war. In the 1980s, Radio and TV Martí, a US-funded broadcaster, was set up in Miami from where it beamed anti-Castro messages into Cuba. In 2010, the US government developed a secret social media program called Zunzuneo, or Cuban Twitter, to foment anti-government protests, a so-called Cuban Spring. And it wasn't even the CIA's idea, it was USAID's, the foreign aid body that is supposed to administer the humanitarian side of American foreign policy.
From the earliest days of the revolution, the American media portrayed Cuba and the Castro Revolution in the most negative ways it could.
These rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers.
So the Cuban government has to be constantly vigilant against these programs, against these propaganda attempts by the American government to help overthrow the Cuban government.
The United States have to clarify if this new approach is to put the future in our hands, or is just another way, another strategy to overthrow the government. If the Cubans want to keep the government, to improve it, or to overthrow them, it's our decision. It's not a decision that can be made from another country.
So I think a decrease in US hostility should lead to an opening of space. It's certainly not the only thing that can and has done that, though. I think it started well before the opening with the United States, and I think it will continue, and I hope that the opening with the United States contributes to that.
So now you're going to have increased amounts of American journalists covering different things about Cuba. The message that's been controlled for decades by the American media is no longer the only message you're going to see. And hopefully the new message is going to be based more on reality of what's happening in Cuba and an exploration of what the revolution really is and not being controlled entirely by the mainstream media.